We have plenty of time for questions. Not questions, just discussion.
Discussion. We can use jumping words.
We have questions, comments, and it could be also singing.
Yeah, I mean, if I may come back to the issue of the focus group. And by the way, in French now we tend to use no longer focus group. At least when we use it as a tool for investigation, anthropological, sociological investigation, but we would rather say non-directive group interviews, right, to put the emphasis on the non-directive and to try to marginalize the idea that there's a focus in the conversation that develops during the interview or whatever. Well, the problem, I mean, the challenge when using focus group is, or non-directive group interviews, is to transform it into a communicative event. And that's where I think it ties up with what Johannes has suggested. And I just wanted to share an experience, and that was really my first experience in Africa and in doing research and in doing field work, and that takes me back to 1969. And I went to the Cameroon with a colleague of mine who was slightly older and who was trained both as a sociologist and as a psychotherapist. And so we were commissioned, and we had not decided on the topic of the study, which was the idea of modernization in non-Cameroonian students. This type of very silly topic that was fashionable at the time. And so we were supposed to do that kind of a study, and she said, okay, we're going to use those group interviews, focus groups. And so we gathered a group of students, and we took them to a village. We didn't want to do it at university for several reasons. That was 69, 1 year after 68, and things were a bit complicated. So we took them to the village, and we started the group, and we started, the prompt was, how do you feel about modernity? What do you think about modernization in this sort of thing? Well, it started, and there were a few exchanges, and very soon we came to sort of dead end, and they started saying, well, in any case, you cannot understand our feeling about modernity because there are things that happen during the night that you cannot relate to, that you cannot even conceive of. And I was extremely young and really new in the business, and didn't have any real textbook knowledge about how to conduct a focus group. And so in particular, I didn't know about the supposed neutrality of the moderator. Mm-hmm. And so I got very irritated about that. And then at the moment, we were in sort of deadlock, and I burst out and I said, oh, look, we do have our nights, and we do have things that happen during the night. We do have our witch doctors. We have our werewolves. That's not particular to you. Who do you think you are? and my colleague, who was a Brigadier, started doing the same thing and say, just utter stories about witchcraft in Greece and so on and so forth. And of course, it created a shock among the participants. But it unblocked the speech. Absolutely. And from then on, we've been able to have a very interesting material. Now, the other thing I wanted to say when we talk about, methodologies, I think it's very important. But when we talk about focus group or non-directive group interviews, it's not only, the methodology is not only in the conducting of the group, but it's also in the techniques of transcription and analysis. And I suppose there's a lot to be said about that, which I'm not going to say.
I'd like to hear what Mike wants to say. I'll just say very, very...
Go, please.
Okay. My comment was at a more abstract level, the same thing that you've been saying, which is I would love in your paper to have some examples of the kinds of things that you found out, not so much in terms of content, but in terms of group dynamics, because what occurs to me is not, this is a scientific method, but the only thing that I would imagine thinking about studying, if I did that, would be what people's ideas of being in a group with strangers and what kinds of narrative genres they could latch on to be able to talk. Yeah. Because if you did that in Java, well, you certainly would get something, and it would certainly be data, but it certainly would not be a focus group about whatever it is that you were doing. So just that same kind of thing. It's an interesting experiment, but it's not really something that I would use as an instrument to find out content.
Yeah, no, it's quite interesting, and that's part of what
the point I was trying to bring up, that we're also creating the communicative situation.
Right.
And, you know, focus groups are a genre that people,
you have to learn to speak that way.
Absolutely. And it turned out that the place where this project was done, development projects are just layer after layer after layer on the ground, because it's, you know, an hour and a half from Nairobi. You know, it's convenient. You can live in Nairobi and go out. So every agency had a project in Machakos. So, you know, in some ways there are people who, you know, were very familiar with it. Some people weren't. And the way focus groups have mushroomed in the U.S., I mean, one of the problems is sometimes what they call the professional focus group participant. Yeah. You know, sort of like, okay, people just do this all the time. How do we get through that?
Michael?
This is a really interesting workshop. I want to say a quick thing about focus groups and then steer from that into a general thing and then back to focus groups. The focus group, the quick thing, it's a trick. I just want you all to know this trick in case it's ever useful. You didn't mention this function of them. I actually use them as educational devices to open a window in people's minds.
Yeah.
So when I do organizational work, I'll pick the most skeptical person about the nature of the research that we do and make them the moderator. And I'm not collecting data now, right? I'm producing for them a breakdown, an intersubjective moment. And 9 times out of 10, I've carefully measured this, 9 times out of 10, I get a huge aha. My God, I didn't know those people could talk. I didn't know what they had to say was so interesting. And suddenly you've gone through a phase transition, like from water to steam, and you can begin to talk about other things and ways to working. So please, if any of you get in those kind of positions, like we've been in a lot, they're really, really useful. Forget the data, right? I mean, they're really, really useful as an eye-opener for the skeptic. Now, I want to skid from that into just a quick observation. I mentioned it to a few of you in conversations. This is really interesting. I mean, I haven't been in an anthro flow for a long time. And so looking at it as an insider-outsider, what's striking to me is, rather than all the differences that are surfacing, are the similarities, and with myself as well. Let me explain why. We have a tradition where whatever the abstract concepts or ideologies or theories we happen to espouse, sooner or later we show you how they work in living color somewhere. Exactly. Everybody has done that. There hasn't been a single talk, even if I'm not familiar with or comfortable with or even don't like the broader framework, where I can't see, aha, I get it now. I see what they're doing, because we're on the ground doing what we do. That's why the intersubject concept is so important, not only for us to develop internally, but for us to use as a vehicle to assert what we are rather than what we are not. It's always about this mutual sense-making, a dynamic process over time, involving an epiphany on the part of the ethnographer and on the part of the people you're working with. That's just, it's in continual motion, and somehow at the end you run out of time and money and you write something. And except now we have, as John said in his talk, that's actually not the case anymore either, because we have continual communication via easier transportation, virtual means, and so on and so forth. So that's very striking to me as an underlying theme of the workshop. There's a statement that would be interesting to figure out how to make, in spite of the differences when people go to a more general conceptual or theoretical framework. All right? So now I'm going to skid back into the ethical part. I often tell outsiders when I talk to them about what I do that I also have political and ethical agendas in my work, because the ethical value has something to do with empathy. I mean, there's millions of studies in not so different domains that show that a lack of a sense of connection with other people explains a whole lot of the problems that occur in the world. I'm like an empathy machine, right? The thing I produce at the end is meant to engender empathy, convey the empathy I experience, filling in that space between us, which is why I think so much of it is translation to some other set of eyes and ears and experiences. That in that sense, the translation with me is the mediator between two worlds. And the ethical, so that's the ethical dimension, I feel. It's that openness that Kevin talked about. rather than dismissing the person with deficit theory and saying, well, obviously you're not well trained, you don't know what you're doing, you're irrational, etc., which is unfortunately the normal stance. It's called naive realism. It's been documented as one of the key problems in the whole field of social psychology and social cognition. How not to let that happen. And that's my ethical obligation, both to experience that and to convey it. The political dimension is, of course, the cliche that we talk about in anthropology, but it's an important one of the voice. That there are other points of view here that need to be represented and expressed that aren't part of the discourse that I'm now speaking into from that experience. Right? That those voices need to be part of the conversation. So spinning now right back to more of an issue that's I might have forgotten where I was going to land. I'm flying, but I can't find the airport. It must be the clouds. So I guess I'll stop with that then and just say that it's this, unless it comes back to me. So I see your mom was telling you, what the fuck is it going to get over? So stop then with the second part, which was really the most important anyway, which was the commonality as a basis for the workshop to start making some kind of sense out of the differences, and not to get lost in the fact that there are these alternative conceptual frameworks, because I think when we go to the ground, each of us in our different ways in our presentations, when we go to the ground and tell the stories about what happened and how it happened and what the result was, we're very much on the same track, and that's important to articulate. And I think I remembered what the third point was. Nobody talks much about audience. I'm coming back to you now. And it's because in the academic tradition, you are the audience, and your advisor is the audience, and your subfield is the audience, and the peer review process is your audience. And that's fine. But as soon as you go and start working at the Smithsonian, or working in these contexts outside, James has a great line where he says, as soon as public health thinks about qualitative research, their mind slides right to focus groups. Yeah. Boom, it happens in about a millisecond. So audience, I'd like to hear what some of you folks who are teaching me a great deal about this mutual sense-making over time, this intersubjectivity, how and in what way you think of what if there's a very different audience as well for the results of your work? Not today, not right this minute. Today, yes, but not right this minute, but at some point during the workshop.
We have a few questions.
Yeah. To focus groups, thank you very much, Corinne, because I learned from you that using focus groups as a method or an approach can be very positive. I have done a lot of focus groups in my life and had taken a negative view, so I really changed my perspective from what you said. I have done over many years lots and lots and lots of focus groups in Bhutan, in the kingdom of Bhutan up in the Himalayas, when I was working for UNICEF or UNDP or World Food Programme, because that's what all these people do, and they do it all the time. And as you say, some ordinary villages, people become absolutely professional focus group people, because like just in a little kingdom like Bhutan, which has 500,000 people, there is an overload, a surfeit of development agencies. The Dutch are there, then the Swiss and the Danes and all the hundreds and Canadians. And all have their groups. And so my experience is that that what you get, of course, and these groups are arranged with the presumption that you will get the real knowledge about how they really think about pregnancy and delivery and all that stuff. So my experience, of course, was that was practically of no use, that it was only by being able to talk to people outside of those focus groups that you could get that. And I also did notice that depending on whether they were, these focus groups were operating in a territory controlled by the Swiss or the Dutch or the Danes or the Canadians, they had learned to express things in different ways. So again, speaking of intersubjectivity, I just wanted to put that one up. So thank you. I really understood now that it can be a positive approach. And given what you said about confrontation, I thought that was provocative. I didn't know that. And I would like to hear more about... Yeah, Fabian. Johannes, you please tell us, explain, can you?
No. I can tell you what my nickname was among the students when I taught at the National University of Zaire in Lubumbashi. Taught there for 2-3 years. When I would drive up to campus in the morning, and they would stand around in groups and would shout from Bubishi, Bubishi Benafika. Ubishi is the essence of contrariness.
So you were the contrary, huh?
Yes. So maybe it's the character. Or as what's his name, was it Bauman or Rogers? Forgot now. Who says when this was University of Pennsylvania, I was visiting them, and the student who brought me to the department led me through a classroom in which Roger Abrams was teaching there. And I found this kind of funny, and he looked at me and said, "Hey, Johannes," and he says, "Well, this is Johannes Fabian. He's got an attitude." This I took as a motto for a book. No, it's seriously speaking, it is the idea of an agonistic element in thought. You can call it dialectic. Bachelard somewhere says, every thought in its emergence is a polemical thought. You argue against something, because otherwise you have no motive. So that's all there is behind it. And of course, it not only imposes or opposes this sort of wellness approach to others. It above all opposes the scientific idea of the neutrality of thought. As if one could move in some kind of neutral vacuum without worrying about etc.
But isn't it a part of a line of thinking in the German philosophical tradition that most recently we refer to as critical theory, but then that's reflected through Marxism, that's reflected through Hegelian dialectic?
Yes.
I mean, there's the model of the agony and the opposition.
Yes. We can go back to Thomas Aquinas, who, when he exposes a chapter, exposes the thesis in his Sum of Theology, and then comes zet contra. What? Yeah. So maybe that's the deepest ground.
Eric and then Alexander.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask or comment on this ethics and confrontation thing, because my experience is that when I tried it, and I'm at an undergraduate school, not graduates, but they tend to interpret IRBs and ethical codes in anthropology in a very, to me, typically middle-class American way, which I also realize is not just American and just not just middle-class American, but it's a very, they take the do no harm aspect, and they run really far with that, and they assume that harm is psychological pain inflicted on another. And so what they assume is that if you hurt someone's feelings, if you hurt someone's feelings, that you're being unethical. And so what I try to show them is that you can't do really good anthropology and worry about hurting other people's feelings. That doesn't mean you shouldn't worry about it, but what I mean is you can't start to think, oh, I can't hurt people's feelings, because if you do that, you're going to only be researching with people like Lao Tse, who I never felt I hurt any Lao Tse's feelings, and I always felt that I learned quite a bit, but they were easy ethically, because the kinds of things they wanted me to know were the kinds of things that were really easy to accept. One of those things to me nowadays, and it's a real problem, is basic environmentalist issues. So groups that, and I would put the Lao Tse in this camp, who are very much about green ideas, are really easy for us to accept and to act as spokespeople for. That doesn't mean it's a bad thing. I'm not saying don't do that. But what I find interesting about the idea of confrontation is that confrontation does come with yourself. That is, you suddenly realize there's someone telling you that you're off base about where your comfort zone, your moral comfort zone. And it is in those kinds of encounters that you think more deeply about all the issues that we want to talk about, like engaged anthropology and so forth. And just to maybe put the other side of the coin to this, a lot of times when I read people who say they're engaged anthropologists, you can almost predict. You start the paper or article, and you know what side of the fence they're going to be on, and you know that's not going to really cost them very much. and so forth. A really group of a lot of pretty wild hairs into a very normal, not normal science, but normal ethics entity that is producing a very, not a very thoughtful or even politically powerful.
Unfortunately, there is a very, very depressing, to me depressing, but pragmatic background to this. As I said in the paper, professional ethics, or ethics, you need professionals. That is, if there is so much talk about ethics, in the 70s it was the beginnings of that. That was an alternative to epistemological critique, was ethical breastbeating. We've been bad, now we're no longer bad. We confess, but now we're good.
Confession.
Confession, yeah. But now what's happening now is, by the economics of things and so on, an increasing number of anthropologists will not have this fantastic privilege that you and I have, that we are being paid for something that we would pay for in order to do it, right? If we had the money. Many have to earn their bread. As what? As professionals. I'm not a professional. I have never been a professional in my life. If I had wanted to be this, I would have become a lawyer or a physician, not an anthropologist. But there are our students, our colleagues and so on, who have to earn the bread and butter.
It's not always economic necessity. It's not always economic.
Yeah, well,
I understand that.
you should,
It's not always, originally it was motivated by the collapse of the economic job market in the early 70s.
Yes.
But now it's not, a
No,
lot of people choose
it
it.
runs on its own steam. I mean,
They choose it.
Yes, because you can now by being able to show a code of ethics, you sort of prove we're professionals, right? Because we have that code of ethics. And I think that, for instance, these exactions of human subjects and so on, it's to a large extent our own fault to have accepted this or not worked against it early enough. It sort of came on us, and it's the same in the States as in Europe, because we didn't want to endanger our status with the funding agencies and with our administrations and so on. And so, okay, we signed these things, and now it's too late. I hope it's not too late, but to me it looks like it's too late. Sorry, I'm talking too much.
I have a question for Michael real quick, because I thought you were taking the term professional in a much more global sense, and you were maybe seeing it as profession versus practice.
Academic.
Yeah, I didn't. I thought you were assuming that it's a more global term.
Not an absolute, I might have misunderstood.
I meant it concretely, like lawyers or physicians.
Yeah, but also in the academic world, right? When you say, I was wondering, if you say that anthropologists are becoming professional, you don't mean that they're going into applied anthropology, do you? Or do you mean that or do you mean also that they're in the academy?
One term of artist is not an absolute, right? But one of the ways that folks make the cut is professional versus academic anthropology. That's one way. It can mean other things.
Yeah,
I think you can take professional and you get into the argument about practicing applied.
Right. To me, the word, the ethic word,
Okay, Eric, can we go back to maybe Alexander, as a lot of people who want to ask questions, make comments?
I realize that all the interventions are on this side of the room, but it's okay because Johannes is on the other side. And it's actually a very simple question, and I'm wondering, Johannes, and in reference to Kevin's paper, if you had been working mostly in West Africa, if you would have used negotiation instead of confrontation.
Possible. I don't know that, but I know that much of what I then later intellectualized was part of my first field experience, because by accident I ran into this group that from the very first day determined or set the terms on which we were interacting, and who were not sitting back and let themselves be observed, but came actively against me. And so that was my primary experience. And, but, I don't know. I mean, I could have turned out Jeremy Bossavain, and we had...
Okay, I have a list. God. You wanted to speak, or you were discussing, giving your turn, okay? Pascal.
I'll go after Pascal.
Okay.
I just wanted to make a comment on ethics review board and the issue of professionalism, and that ethics review as a way to prove that you're acting in a professional manner. To me, it's exactly the reverse. To me, the ethics review board is me not being treated as a professional, and I just wanted to point out that there's other models in other professions on how to treat ethics. For instance, doctors. The presumption is that doctors are competent, and if people feel slighted, they can take the doctor to a review board of their peers, and then it's an ex post facto thing. Whereas the ethics review, as we have it in the universities now, you're taking me to a board of people that are not anthropologists, that I don't feel understand my field. Before I can even set foot on the field, to me, that's not treating me as a professional. It's treating me precisely as not a professional.
Well, what I was saying is, we let the selves happen because too many of us thought it would be good to become professionals like doctors and so on. That was the wrong turn, the first turn. What's happening now is the punishment for that. But the wrong turn was taken much, much earlier.
But it's also tied into funding structures, because it's a requirement for funding, and it's a generalization of a biomedical model of harm that comes out of Tuskegee. There were harms, and that has just been generalized.
So Rob, you're missing your turn again, so Loki.
Even though I'm sitting on the other side, my views are not much different from what Johannes was saying. But every text in a context, So when we were dealing with these issues of professionalization, issues of ethics, we were not really working in isolation. We were really responding to what other professionals were saying. We were also responding to the kind of demands which were made on us as anthropologists, in the society in which we live, as well as our colleagues from sociology and politics and economics and other things, So one has to keep in mind the context in which these issues were really dealt with.
I just want to make a quick comment on focus groups. I had the fortunate experience of supervising a student from France who had been trained in political science and marketing and eventually came here to do anthropology with us. And she was sure that she wanted to build the Solomons. She did focus groups on a topic that she was working on. And I insisted that she did something else, and we finally negotiated all this. But she said, you know why we do focus groups in marketing? Because you guys in anthropology are so slow in getting new things out and understanding everything, it doesn't pay off. So she had this idea that, of course, it's a marketing position, well, we are much more efficient. You can get exactly the same kind of, she was sure that you could get exactly the same type of results through a focus group and much more faster and more efficient and just as good as you could get through 6 months of participant observation and blah, blah, blah. And I forced her to do something else, and then she had an epiphany in the field. She realized that, oh, maybe you can get something else out of interviews and participant observation, whatever we define this, an interaction with people and things. And then, so that was, for her, totally eye-opener. But the other thing that I wanted to say also is that we've been talking about intersubjectivity. We've also talked about how, but I think it's important to try to, for me at least, try to understand how does the other experiences the kind of intersubjectivity as a condition for conversation. How do I know? How do I know that we are on the same plane? Or is it important to know? Maybe it's not important. But I think it is, for me, important to know that maybe something is happening. Now, what is the proof that something is happening? That the person keeps talking, as Johannes was saying, okay, finally we got it, I made the right choice, and the person keeps talking. So how do we know that, I mean, what does intersubjectivity mean also for the other rhythm we're taking? So
well, if he studied phenomenology, he may have the same thoughts that I have, but he doesn't have to have it.
Exactly. Well,
it doesn't mean a thing.
No, exactly. But so is it important? Is it not important?
No, it's only important when we later claim to represent knowledge based on these events. Yeah. That's the only importance.
Yeah.
Screw intersubjectivity. That should be the last word. You know what I mean. You know what I mean.
But I mean, it's an important question.
Yes.
Can I take my turn?
Just as these guys from the Jama movement that I studied, they would have told you.
Yeah.
They were on a level of reflection where they put it into beautiful words. But that would put you ashamed. Okay.
Okay.
I just wanted to riff on Eric. I love riffing on Eric. You're talking about hurting people's feelings. And that's certainly, we understood your explanation was fantastic. We understood, we wanted to have you as a teacher. Right? We understood what's going on in that dynamic, especially those of us who have worked in the States or who grew up in the States who are a part of that kind of cultural ethos, the middle class cultural ethos. And yet at some level, anthropology has American cultural anthropology has contributed to that ethos, if not been foundational, because of the way that we made public ideas about cultural difference and empathy, right? So it's the Margaret Mead school of not hurting other people's feelings, right? There are now some really, there have been before, but there are now more and more critiques of this relativism in American cultural anthropology. I usually think of Johannes' critique of relativism and structuralism. It's really, these are things that we don't tend to question enough. I don't think. There's a really great book about. It's a series of books actually. I don't know if it's here or in the States, but it's called An Example of. The children's books. They're cartoons, and so there's an example of intelligence, and it's Einstein. It's a cartoon version of his life. There's an example of perseverance, and I think it's. Is it a Canadian series? An example of. Margaret Mead is an example of understanding.
Oh, wow.
Right? And I use this in my class. I go through the whole book, and they tell the story of her, and she meets Papa Boaz, and her mother was in the feminist movement, and she listens to people, and the people in Samoa are really happy, and then when she comes back, Marguerite, right? It's really, right? It's dramatic enactment of this, not hurting other people's feelings. And I think it would be neat to talk about about relativism in the American cultural tradition as a wonderful, beautiful idea, but as an ideological position. I see the link between what you're talking about, not hurting other people's feelings, and not wanting to hurt other people's cultural feelings, right? Yeah. Not wanting to offend them, right? Not wanting to call attention to the fact that this is really a serious problem, right? Yeah. And so the example that Denis gave was just fantastic. It was not only an example of how not to let relativism get in your way, but it was also an example of how to do something after the breakdown. There's something that happens after the breakdown. Right. Denis did not say, "Ooh, that's right, I guess I can't understand this because they're just different." No, he said, "Who the hell do you think you are?" Right? We have werewolves. And then it's not that the werewolves are the same as the vampires, right? Because all over Africa there's stories about vampires. It's not that. It's that they can start having discussions about the difference between werewolves and vampires. Right. Because a vampire... Feminism. Or about feminism, for example. In other words, I thought your comment really brought... That's kind of one of the places I'm trying to get us to go. What do we do? In other words, what do we do when we feel like the need as a social scientific observer to kind of pull back? Right?
Yeah, can I riff on the riff for one
riff?
Okay. The classic example of that in the New Earth, where Evans Pritchard has that wonderful thwarted interview, and then he says after people basically will not answer his questions, or it seems there's this antagonism going on that he uses to characterize what newer are like. That becomes the photograph of the newer, right? Now, the rest of the book doesn't have any newer in it, but the interesting thing is right after he says that he has that, and he says, I suffered from neurosis, right? And then he says about how he really, to understand the newer, he had to be with them. And he learned how different his experience was with the Zandi as a result of being with the newer. And so he kind of divined, if you will, and he's a British social anthropologist, cultural pluralism. So a Zandi ethos and newer ethos are two very different things, but you don't learn it unless you're in a context in which you have a confrontation. And so that confrontation stuff, what's interesting, I guess, to me is I like the project of American cultural anthropology. I do believe in cultural pluralism. But I agree with you that a lot of times that whole project comes out of an American kind of cultural relativism that is culturally specific. And so, but you can get to those cultural differences, but only through those kinds of things.
We're not good with confrontation.
Yeah, we're not.
Two comments. One about hurting people's feelings. I am a bit uneasy now because I feel some of you are talking as if people were a people and that they had the same feelings. In every society I have been, there have been such basic disagreements and contestations inside that you will hurt some feelings, whereas others are happy that you speak up for them. So that's one point I want to make. Another is that we have said nothing about hurt, whose people are, again, and who's the people? I have none of you had the experience of becoming persona non grata? Yeah. After my PhD was published on Oman, I couldn't get back for 20 years in Oman. And I had written beautifully about the country. Most tolerant, fabulous country in the world, Oman in Arabia. But what I had written about it wasn't something that the Omani government wanted the Saudi government to think about them. We are living in a world today where it's not just a relationship between people we study and us, but there are many other dimensions. In Bhutan, my God, just one article in the American Anthropologist with just one line that some Bhutanese student at Yale took exception to. And he wrote to the government, persona non grata for 6 years. I mean, these are also dimensions. I think we are simplifying in a way when we now are speaking some of what we are saying when we are speaking about one and the other. Another thing I'd like to say. I come from a background, I come from Scandinavia, and in Scandinavia we are very obsessed, I would say, obsessed with gender equality. But I would like to point out that I am noticing in this group that there is a tendency that males take very much space and time. I mean, I love it. You have fabulous things to say, very, 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 but there are very few female voices. And there are many females here. Why is it that we are not expanding more? Why aren't we coming forward much more? What is the dynamics in our group?
I think it's not, we're not just talking gender, we're talking age.
No, but this is not gender.
This is not. You guys are students, right? Speak for yourself.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. I would love to hear more about also this. Yeah, it's also generational. Yeah, that's true. It's generational too. I would love to hear more from the students.
We will, but a student. And we will this afternoon.
Yeah.
I think Jean-Guy.
Jean-Guy?
Well, I'd like to get, I think the question you asked, Corey, what is knowledge? I like the conclusion, and I think that's what is knowledge? Because in producing something, how do you recognize it? Got me thinking, ways I was not thinking before you. And I would read your paper. And the other issue was with when you say you're trying to understand concepts in Joanna's intellectual apparatus and confrontation, and then you have the other concept you've had, and you make it a precondition. You make confrontation a precondition of intersubjectivity. Is that what you're saying?
Right.
So yeah. So I was kind of, I never thought of in those lines. So how would you know that it's a precondition? Is that the proper way? And I'm not worked enough with those concepts to know, but you seem to have a right to the conclusion. So I was curious, how did you position it that way? And is it important to position it that way?
Well, to be honest, I found a slight contradiction. I think in your earlier writings, it comes off more, you present it more as this sort of prerequisite, that you need this confrontation to get to knowledge production, this confrontation by which then the whole process starts
Not to get to intersubjectivity. Not to get to intersubjectivity.
But even I sense there, even to get into, I think it was a couple quotes I had
It's
with
a quotation from me.
Yes.
Invitation from you, right?
From me, Dr. Herbie.
Oh, meat.
Yes.
From me.
Okay.
Who says, well, we shall maybe ought to think, when we think what is happening in communication, we ought to think more of an exchange of blows rather than an exchange of words. That was, at least it struck me enough to quote him here, but that corresponded to something in my mind.
My theory is so far is that confrontation means problematization of intersubjectivity.
Or kind of rendering conscious of?
Yeah, exactly.
That could be a form of that.
How can I be sure that you're there unless I run into you? That's what it is.
Because you could say, I'm here, right? That's a form of...
I can't be sure. Does he hear me? I don't know. If I run into him, if we confront each other, then I'm sure.
Run into in the way...
Bother you.
In a rugby kind of way?
No, I think that's a strange perception of humanity.
It's a particular perception. It depends on perception.
It depends on the style. It depends on the communicative. It depends on the communicative style of the community to some extent. When I'm doing field work, of course you know. When I'm doing field work in the streets of New York, a perfectly reasonable, neutral question is, "What the fuck are you talking about?" When I'm working with a nice, polite, middle-class group somewhere,
Yeah.
that would be a really bad way to start. But I can problematize the intersubjectivity. Is that part of the methodology grows from what you learn from doing the research, right? And so you can't do an interview until you know how to talk.
I think it has. I was thinking along the lines of rendering the difference, bring it into the realm of consciousness.
Yeah.
And so that could be a physical body check. It could also be saying I'm here. It could be a visual contact. It could be silence.
Right.
That could happen in any number of ways. But there's ways in which we say we're here. And confrontation, at least in American English,
I know it's not good.
We've been through that now. Yeah.
Listen back to
What is the word
We
in
have
Dutch?
to
I'll wrap up with this last
You
comment.
don't know the word in Dutch?
I just want to say that I think that I don't want to collapse confrontation into intersubjectivity.
Yeah.
That's my point. Just sort of say that there is
in Norwegian confrontation.
Hold on. Can you say that again?
I didn't want to collapse intersubjectivity and confrontation. I always felt it was sort of helping apart a bit, that they had a very sort of mutual relationship, and that confrontation gets the ball rolling, and it keeps the ball rolling.
The last one minute. It comes all out of a tradition of thinking, whereby thinking is not the sort of given capacity to reflect what is in the outside world. Thinking has to be done. It's an activity. And the outside world is what you run up against as a thinker. That's the tradition.
That's good.
Yeah.
Okay, listen, I want to be Foucauldian about this. We need to have lunch. It's 12:15. The food is different today. It's in styrofoam containers. There's as you come up on the left. I'm saying this because it's written in French. Okay, so I'm not so we don't understand. The containers are written on the left. First, there's small square containers with salad in them. That's written salad. Then I'm not sure what the order is. But there are 3 different types of main courses. There's beef, which is bœuf, chicken, which is poulet, and then there's a vegetarian empanada, which is Spanish. If any of you have had a chance to talk with him, I invited him to be the moderator for this session.
I'm not going to dance.
So I'll hand the session over to you. This is going to be a very tightly timed session because we want to focus on the exchange between between the audience members and the panel roundtable presenters. Denis will talk for about 10 minutes. Each of the students will talk for 10 minutes, and then we're going to, after some comments by Denis, we'll open it up for discussion. So I have Foucault this afternoon.
Okay, thanks very much, Bob. And well.